Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. As we all know, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, and today we have the opportunity to review three proposals designed to support locally driven historic preservation efforts, broaden the appeal of our national parks, and promote good stewardship. We are also reviewing legislation that creates a new memorial and national monument managed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. While that legislation is not strictly related to the National Park Service, its goals and historic preservation mission make it worthy of our consideration. National parks have been called America's best idea, but that idea must be allowed to adapt and evolve in order to preserve and honor our diverse American heritage. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt once remarked that, quote, "There is nothing so American as our national parks. The fundamental idea behind the parks is that the country belongs to the people that it is in process of making for the enrichment of the lives of all of us," unquote. And expanding the reach of our parks also makes good economic sense. Last year's record-setting 307 million visitors supported $32 billion in economic activity, a 4-to-1 return on investment for every federal dollar that is appropriated to the National Park Service. This economic activity has irreplaceable ripple effects in neighboring communities that this committee has a responsibility to recognize. And in order to make sure of the continued support of our national parks by the American people, this committee must routinely evaluate visitor services and efforts at the local level to make historic preservation improvements at individual park sites. The bills on our agenda today help us meet these goals. The bill introduced by Representative Beyer, for example, seeks to improve visitor experiences at the Marine Corps War Memorial near Arlington National Cemetery by building a new visitor services facility, including permanent restroom facilities. Representative Katko's bipartisan legislation reflects the desire of his constituents to better preserve and recognize the national significance of Fort Ontario in western New York. Fort Ontario is a colonial and Revolutionary War era fort that was also used to house Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Nazi Germany, the only one of its kind in our country during that time. As such, this legislation is a welcome reminder of our country's past commitment to the safe harbor of refugees seeking to flee the perils of war and political oppression around the world. Representative Carter's legislation seeks to expand the Fort Frederica National Monument in Georgia, which preserves a nearly 300-year-old military outpost and was originally designated as a national monument by President Franklin Roosevelt using the Antiquities Act. It is important to note this legislation would not be possible without the use of funds from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Land to expand the monument will be purchased from willing sellers using money from LWCF appropriated by Congress, providing yet another example of why the Land and Water Conservation Fund deserves permanent authorization and full funding. While not directly related to the National Park Service, Representative Knight's legislation meets our shared goals of promoting more public access to our public lands, proper local stewardship, and supporting local preservation efforts. This legislation will allow the Secretary of Agriculture to accept donations to design and build a memorial in consultation with local stakeholders, including the state of California, local governments, tribal governments, and the public. The bill will also create a new national monument on 440 acres of existing Forest Service land, adding no new land to the federal estate. I look forward to hearing more about these individual pieces of legislation from each of you and the federal land management agencies after your testimony, coming after your testimony. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to have you all before us. Obviously, strong advocates for your local communities who are so invested in historic preservation. And Mr. Beyer, I don't have any questions for you, but obviously from your testimony, adding these new facilities will clearly improve the visitor experience, and how fortunate you are to have a private benefactor who's done so much to protect the many landscapes and the many landmarks of Washington, D.C. So just to sort of commend you for that. And Mr. Carter, I wanted to go to you. You have said that this legislation will have to be amended so that only parcels that have willing sellers can be transferred to the Park Service. And that is good to hear. And it's about 21 acres. That's right.
That is correct.
Do you believe those additional acres are sufficient to the goals of the legislation? And if you could again sort of set out those goals.
Well, I do. The National Park Service has done a survey of the area and has noted that there's a high probability that there are actually artifacts there that would be that would really help with the history, help to tell the history of Georgia, and really feel like the National Park Service would do a much better job at being stewards of that area and for that purpose.
And does this have bipartisan? You have referenced that you have the support of the delegation, so that obviously evidences strong bipartisan support.
Absolutely. All 14 members of the Georgia delegation are in favor of this.
That's good to hear. And Mr. Katko, to follow up on your legislation, will this just to clarify, will this legislation create a new national park?
Yes.
Is it premised upon a study first, and what kind of study will this be?
Well, it's just the study that the Park Service normally does before you have a precursor to having put on the Park Service registry, if you will. And we're told this is the next step you have to take before you go to the final approval. And that's I understand it's going to take a couple of years to do that. But as I want to reiterate again, the support is extraordinarily strong for it.
And Congress does eventually have to approve all national parks, so the study will be the basis on which you bring this proposal forward.
That's exactly right.
And why are you, again, just to have you reiterate your testimony, why are you and your constituents interested in possibly creating a new national park?
Well, I think we looked at it, and I had close consultation with the National Park Service before we instituted the bill. And first of all, I want to make sure it fit the criteria. And of course, we can't hold them to what their initial indications are, but the uniqueness of it is something that is interesting to the Park Service, and the fact that it's such a long historical significance. And when you walk the grounds there, it's hard to describe the history. And these buildings are built in the 1700s. They're falling into disrepair now that New York State's not even paying for the heat in the wintertime for the buildings inside the fort. And then, of course, with the significance with respect to World War II and the uniqueness of that, the international Jewish community is very, very interested in supporting this park, and both from a public standpoint and also a financial standpoint. And given that, and the fact that New York State seems to be ready to be willing to transfer the park to us, it seems like preserving this really a jewel of our history is definitely worthy of park recognition.
It's my understanding that it would be the first National Park Service site dedicated to Jewish history in the United States.
That's exactly right.
And does it have a bipartisan support?
Well, I've had some meetings up there, and I went to the meeting thinking there'd be 10 people there. And I walked in, and literally there was hundreds of people, standing room only, media's there, and the enthusiasm and a cross-section of people interested in this, it indicates to me it's not just a source of pride, but people really want to get this done, and the amount of support for it is overwhelming. And there's one woman I haven't turned on to you yet because she'll call you every day. But she calls me every day to ask me about it, and she was just retired as the head of the Safe Haven Museum. There is a very strong support for it. It's from a vast cross-section of the community.
Well, it's always great to see these initiatives coming out of the local community that values historic preservation. Mr. Knight, a question around your legislation. Will it add any new land to the federal estate?
No, it will not.
And how will the funds be raised for the development, design, and location of the proposed national monument?
All private funds. This has been a project that has been trying to move forward in the past 5, 10, 15 years, and it's just been stalled. But the groundswell of the support throughout the community is to get this done. It will be raised all privately.
Will there be follow-on support for maintenance?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.